We've been warned for the last 30 years that climate change is a major problem facing our existence.
Denying climate change is like seeing 100 doctors, 99 of them say you're ill, and you believe the one who says you're not.
20 of the hottest years on record have occurred in the last 22 years.
When your house is on fire, you can break down the door and crash through windows to save people inside. The rules are different. And our house is on fire, the planet's burning up.
This is due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere, CO2 from burning fossil fuels.
I've seen glaciers in New Zealand that have retreated beyond recognition. They're just a pimple on the top of a mountain because of climate change.
The science is clear. What happens in the next 10 years will affect the next 1,000 years. But can we solve the problem? Or is it too little, too late? In 2015, the UN's Paris Climate Accord called for a net zero CO2 emissions target globally by 2050 in order to stop the world from heating up by 2 degrees Celsius. Roddy Chishick was part of the negotiating team at the Paris Climate Accord.
One of the mechanisms that the UN tries to negotiate or develop is how the developed countries can help the developing countries reach the same kind of prosperity, but also get to the end point, which is where we're using as much renewable energy as possible.
In the industrialized world, we are still burning fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal to create energy. Energy that we use to live, to heat and light our homes, and to power our transport systems. One way to solve the problem of energy consumption is to switch to renewable forms of energy that do not produce CO2. Dr. Andrew Crossland is an energy scientist and specialist in energy storage. He runs a company called MyGridGB that analyses the UK's energy mix.
Over the last 4 weeks, MyGrid data is showing 0.1% of electricity has come from coal, which is absolutely phenomenal, given that 7 years ago, 40% of our electricity was coming from coal. The rapid decline of coal in the UK is absolutely, it's inspirational, it's world-changing. The renewables in the UK are predominantly wind and solar, and in the last couple of years they've overtaken nuclear as the largest supply of low-carbon energy in Britain. And that's a really fantastic story. The UK's had an amazing success in onshore and now offshore wind and solar. Over 55% of electricity has come from low-carbon sources, which is a phenomenal statistic. The technology is there to store renewables and use them when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining. People see it as hugely important in moving solar from day to night, moving wind from that windy week in the winter to that still cold week a couple of days later. The exciting deployment is in electric cars. When you look at the amount of cars coming on the system and the batteries in those cars that enable us to run without petrol, without diesel, and charging them up when it's windy and when it's sunny, so they're not charging when the coal plants or the gas plants are online is key to the transition.
There are still, unfortunately, some major barriers to owning an electric car. One is that there aren't enough charging stations across the UK to make long journeys efficient. It takes about 45 minutes to completely recharge a car. Secondly, it's cost of entry. This particular e-Golf costs £37,000, whereas its combustion engine equivalent about £25,000. If an electric vehicle is built through an energy-hungry manufacturing process, it could end up generating as much CO2 as a petrol equivalent. For a vehicle to really be free from CO2 emissions, the energy that creates and powers it has to be green too. One form of sustainable energy creation is biomass. Biomass turns methane and CO2 into energy.
Biomass is a really interesting low carbon form of electricity generation. Yes, it's taking methane and you turn that into electricity, which has a better carbon impact. I think more fundamentally, it's very easy to store biomass. We're talking about heaps of wood, we're talking about gas that can be easily stored and used when we need it. And for me, it's the fuel you use when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. It's that filler that we can easily store and use it to keep fossil fuels off the system.
Wyke Farms is an internationally recognised cheese-making business based in Somerset. It uses methane from its dairy herd and cheese-making process to power its business.
In countries that we're selling cheese and butter to all over the world, they love to know that their product that they're buying from a shop is not just made by a family farmhouse cheesemaker, but is made using renewable energy and linking the farm with the environment.
Wyke Farms produce enough biogas to export the excess back onto the national grid.
It's really all about not just the Wyke Farms 100% green process. It's not just about making our farm green, but it's also about making our suppliers and other people we work with green. And many people and companies out there are willing to buy green gas certificates and pay that bit extra to know that their energy is generated from renewable sources.
If the power at each stage is generated using sustainable energy, then electric vehicles become a much greener alternative, from creation to consumer. While the UK is on its way to decarbonising, China and India have hit the peak of their industrialisation. 75% of India's energy still comes from coal, and China is responsible for nearly a third of global CO2 emissions.
There's a lot of talk about India and China and other developing countries around their sometimes increasing carbon emissions. And I think it's important to remember they're a third of the world's population. They've still got a lower carbon emission per capita than the US or the UAE or the UK or Western Europe or Australia or New Zealand. And the pollution, if ever you've been to Beijing or Delhi, is horrendous. Those governments will not survive if those pollutants aren't dealt with. There is historical precedent in China of governments being brought down on environmental issues.
The UN said we need to bring down fully by 2050, decarbonised economy or carbon neutral by 2050. That's a global thing that needs to happen. That means the UK needs to do it far, 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 far quicker. Because, for instance, global south countries who are most affected by this, who are only now sort of industrialising, that process has got to continue. We can't stop them short. We've got to do everything we can to bring it down as quickly as possible, give them that little leeway, and then they'll come down later. You know, it's not that suddenly we can all cut out at the same time. So 2025, 2030, I mean, I'm not a climate scientist. I don't know. I can't sit here and say, oh, this is why. I think we just need to do things as quickly as possible.
A timeline is definitely something that is at the forefront of climate change. We have a limited amount of time that we can affect those pledges that have been made. Realistically speaking, we need to tackle it from a number of different angles, and it is definitely a stretched target to be able to reach it by 2025 or even by 2030.
I think as a country it's really important to understand how long it's going to take to decarbonise. And a really important parameter for me is just a target we're all aiming for. There's a government target of a Committee on Climate Change target of 100 grams of carbon in electricity by 2030. And we're running about 260 at the moment as an average. So there's a glide path down to that 100 grams. Technically, could we do it today? Could we install enough solar and batteries? Absolutely. It'd be very expensive. But yes, we could do it.
One of Theresa May's last acts as Prime Minister was to legally bind the UK to reaching a net CO2 emissions target by 2050, the first country in the world to do so. While we still don't know who will take her place as leader, none of the contenders has prioritised climate change or promised to reduce the target timeframe. Herein lies the problem. Government policy is often driven by priorities, and the UK is currently distracted by Brexit, a priority that has cost the UK £87 billion already, or 2.4% of our GDP. Despite this, the UK government is focusing more on leaving the EU than leaving a planet hospitable for future generations, whatever the cost.
So in terms of the barriers between now and a net zero carbon emission, we've got political barriers. So we have a Chancellor yesterday saying how the cost of decarbonisation and how he's concerned about the impact of that on the economy. We've got economic barriers, so how do we invest and put all this capital down on projects today and achieve the low carbon aims? How do we finance these projects? So I do some work in New Zealand on their policy, and we've shown how you can reduce the cost of solar there through effective policy by 75% just by having a supportive government policy. And finding that upfront capital and giving investors the security that their investment is going to return steadily over 25 years and attracting those type of investors is really important. That to me is the role of government and policy. It's about giving revenue security to encourage the investment. And there's a lot of people in solar and wind and storage saying, if you give me revenue security, I'll give you the cost down. Don't wait for the technology, give the revenue security today and you'll get the reward through the decarbonisation and the stable power prices.
Increasing funding into renewables will reduce the cost of entry across the energy supply chain. But will it happen fast enough and solve the climate crisis before it's too late?
Climate change is so complex that there isn't one solution. There's no silver bullet that is going to solve climate change. But in your question, you almost have the answer that there are a number of different ways that this can be tackled, and it's finding the ones that will produce the greatest impact on the likes of CO2 emissions to be able to solve climate change as a whole.
So there's a really interesting question in climate change and decarbonisation. So which horse do we back? Which spear do we throw? And I think the reality is we've got to throw all the spears at the problem. The key to decarbonisation is diversifying your energy supply. It's diversifying it to hydro and to wind and to solar and to battery and to electric vehicles and to hydrogen. Whatever technologies you have, it's about backing all of them in the right way and letting the market work out what the right mix of those solutions is.
Imagine there was an asteroid that was coming down from outer space, and we looked up in the stars and astronomers were telling us we've got 10 years before it hits us, it's going to wipe out everyone. What happens then? What do governments do? They do everything they can straight away to make sure that doesn't happen, build the big lasers to shoot it down, whatever has to happen. That's what we're facing now. It's exactly that. We just need to act as quickly as possible. We don't have time to procrastinate. So I mean, 2025, 2030, we just need to do everything we can.
We're not talking about crazy ideas. We're talking about a series of incremental improvements towards a target. And a lot of the technology we have ready to go to make this work. It's about financing it and getting it slowly installed in the system.
I feel we just need to cut through the charade. We're all pretending things are fine, and we need to cut through that, and things are not fine. But we can do this, but we need to act now.
For now, the growing global demand for energy is still outpacing decarbonisation. While use of renewables is increasing, it is yet to offset expansion in fossil energy. What is certain is that the clock is ticking, and we're running out of time.